how are we sequencing and prioritizing that work? And the more you can be on your front foot about that, the better posture you have to create a retainer that puts you in a much better position in terms of not having to discount, in terms of not having to have additional overhead management and risk associated to sort of building up a debt to that client on the balance sheet, or essentially having to be very reactive from a resource planning and work management perspective. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm joined today again by the one and only Carson Pierce. Carson, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again. You keep on bringing me back. I don't know why, but here we are.
It's amazing. It's like if you pay your podcast guests, they just keep coming back.
Yeah, I guess I
Funny
don't
how
have
that
much
works.
choice.
Yeah. I'm excited for today's conversation. We're talking about retainers, which is retainers. What an interesting conversation. Ask 10 different agencies what a retainer is to them. You get 10 different answers, and therein lies the nuance, right? So I guess, let's start there. Why talk about retainers, and what the heck is a retainer?
Yeah, so I have a conversation about retainers with different agencies almost every week. And there's so much going on with this whole conversation, so it's no surprise that people have different views of things. But basically, in a nutshell, it's you're getting recurring revenue for an agreement where you're doing a set amount of work for a set price every month. And of course, the big benefit of that is you've got some guaranteed revenue that you just know is going to come in, and you can put it on your books, and you can plan around it and hire around it and all that sort of thing. So it's good for you. For the client, it can be good for them because they know that they've got a team ready to go doing the work that they need on a regular basis instead of having to book in for a project for who knows when. So there are benefits on both sides, but that's my quick take on it. What's your more nuanced take, I'm sure, here?
Well, I want to start by kind of going back to the history of the retainer, sort of where it started. And it was started in more traditional professional services, which sort of predates the advertising industry, which is actually still a fairly new industry. And certainly the digital, marketing agency is a very new concept. And so if you go back to old school professional services, the definition of a retainer was really just the idea of an upfront fee to secure services in advance. And this was predicated on the idea that these businesses are capacity constrained. And so if you were a big client and you wanted to make sure that when you had stuff that you wanted to get done, they were going to be available to do it whenever you needed it, then you would pay in advance to secure that capacity. And of course, all kinds of reasons that's advantageous to both the client and the firm. And today, I think that has taken on a bit of a different definition, which is almost more just akin to recurring, right? So I think in most digital marketing agencies and most, agencies in general, when we think about a retainer, what we're really thinking about is like, oh, this is recurring work that is like happening over and over again. But the truth is, the concept of a retainer is very abstract and is sort of fundamentally rooted in this idea of an upfront payment for services. And then of course, you start to get into all of the different variations on that we see. Is that client paying in advance for hours at a certain rate, for days at a certain day rate, for individuals, for, there's infinite complexity to if it's a time and materials based retainer. If there are unused hours, are those hours going to roll over? Are they not going to roll over? Are you only going to bill them for the amount of time that was spent, right? Like, how does that work? And we can get into all of the nuances of that. If not, then, are you going to charge them that flat fee every month? And what if you go over? What if there's extra time that's billed or not billed, worked but not billed? And then you, of course, can still apply all the other elements of pricing to recurring work and call it a retainer. You can do value-based things. You can do performance-based things. You can do things that are based on a percentage of ad spend, a percentage of markup on top of other pass-through expenses. We're even starting to see a lot more licensing enter the market, especially as, the barriers to creating your own intellectual property continue to come down with AI. And so all of those things I think, have to consider in the conversation of retainer, which is, basically become a really, really, really big container for a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah, the one that you touched on there that irks me, I don't know. Uh, I don't love it. It's the whole idea of just paying a big amount of money upfront for a bucket of hours that the client can then spend whenever they want. Usually there's some kind of time frame around it, like in the next year, but there's so little control over that, that it just becomes a huge problem to manage. So I don't like that one, but like almost everything else you've talked about there, they're all variations of good ideas and can fit in different situations. So, but man, you're right. There's a lot to it. Where do you start with all this?
Well, we will get into in a moment, I think, a conversation about how to identify maybe what the appropriate way to structure a retainer is for your firm, and a framework on how to think about that. But I will kind of take a step back and continue to double click on what you've just raised, which is some of the operational traps that I think firms can fall into with, in particular, time and materials based retainers, where there is this sense of, you're basically doing an accrual concept, and truly, like, this is where accrual accounting becomes so important for agencies, and this is such a good example of why. So let's imagine you're selling the bucket of hours. Right, so that's probably like the worst case scenario. Is, you said, hey, this client has bought 500 hours and they can just kind of use them whenever they want, and they've prepaid those things. And that is an example of a thing that an agency does out of basically trying to create some kind of an incentive to either get cash up front, generally from a place of desperation, or, a lack of leverage, or like that they're trying, like, this is just a way that they're trying to bring in more business, um, or they're trying to, like, secure business in some kind of a way, and they're willing to make a lot of compromises in order to make that happen. And in this case, that compromise is they're at that client's whim, and they now have to carry this liability on their balance sheet. The problem is, I've never seen an agency that was doing this that had that liability on their balance sheet. But this could get pretty material. Let's imagine you do that 10 times. So now you have 10 clients with 500 hours that have been prepaid. And imagine, this is extremely problematic. This all happened in 1 month. You had a great month of sales. You sold 5,000 hours in advance. You got paid for 5,000 hours in this month. And then you fast forward 6 months later, and all 10 of those clients happen to say, we want all of those 500 hours worked this month. You have all kinds of problems now. This is like, I'm dragging this out in a worst case scenario, but I mean, we've seen more, like, less extreme versions of this play out in real life.
I can think of one just a few months ago where we had an agency come in and they were up against the wall, like barely making payroll. And meanwhile, on the books, they had all kinds of work that they owed for clients. So they have to pay people to do this work that they've already been paid for, but they don't have any money to pay those people. Like, it was a nightmare. So yeah, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble here.
100%. Right. And so the reality is, it's like when you booked that revenue in the first month, that was deferred revenue. You actually didn't earn any money that month. You didn't earn it until month 6, when the client said, hey, we need you to do this work now. But unfortunately, most firms are not keeping track of this debt, because that's what the hours are that you've sold in advance. Or if you're on a rollover model where it's like, oh, the client had 10 hours left this month, so we'll roll them over to next month. And, you let that stuff drag on long enough, all of a sudden you have this giant bank of hours that are essentially a debt that you owe to your clients, and it's a liability that you carry on your balance sheet. And yeah, if all that stuff starts to kind of land in a month, you could end up with some serious, serious cash flow problems and a serious lack of visibility into your profitability as a result. So I generally don't like retainer models that create this liability that needs to be sort of carried, and ideally should be represented on the balance sheet if you're going to do it. A, because it's operationally very expensive, and B, because it does create a lot of risk and sort of behoove, if you are in that situation, it behooves you to be very proactive, and you're incentivized to basically pay down that debt as much as possible. Your incentive is to try to get the client to use those hours as quickly and as early as possible, so you can earn that money and move it from the balance sheet to the P&L. So, anyway, with that out of the way, we could talk. Yeah, I'll bounce that off of you, Carson.
Well, no, I was just thinking about, for the, I guess, more naive agency owner, it can feel like, hey, we already got paid for this. It's not something we need to worry about now. So there's just so little urgency around fulfilling that. But you're right. The problem comes when, they're calling that in, and meanwhile you've got all these other projects on the go. You pile it onto your team. Now you're missing deadlines on other stuff. It's just, I mean, we do a lot of capacity management at Parakeeto, and this is one of the things that scares me the most, is like, hey, we've done all this planning, everything's looking great, but we haven't accounted for what if that client comes back to us asking for all these hours now. It's just not a good thing.
Totally. And you're right. It leaves you in one of many bad positions. You either say no to work that could be actually generating income for you in that moment in time, you take it on and overwork your team, or you take on costs as you bring in freelancers and additional capacity to take that on. And all of those things can be really, really challenging from a cash flow perspective. And the bigger that debt becomes, the bigger that risk becomes. The other thing that I'll say is, this is a kind of a more of an unlikely situation, but like, imagine you're going through an M&A transaction and, everything's like hunky dory. And then the client finds out that you have tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, essentially, that's not represented anywhere on your balance sheet. Like, that's a ticking time bomb, right? So it really does behoove you to be clear on these things. I digress. So with that in mind, I think the big question here is, okay, knowing that there's so many different variations on retainers and recurring work in general, how does one determine the right way to structure a retainer for their given situation? Of all these different things, what's the best one? And unfortunately, I can't tell you what the best one is, but I can help you figure out what the best one might be for your situation. And for this, I'm going to refer you to our pricing model quadrant, which, if you haven't heard about, then you're hearing about it for the first time. We'll leave some links in the show notes to some resources that go a lot deeper on this, another full podcast episode where we go a lot deeper on this. But the big idea with the pricing model quadrant is we want to take into account two important factors anytime that we sell anything to anyone, which are, how much value is there in this engagement to the client, right? So is this a very high value thing where it's solving a big problem that's really expensive, creating a lot of value for them, and they don't really feel like they have a lot of other choices except for you, in which case you have a lot of leverage, and you can you use that leverage to charge ideally premium rates, a lot more than what anyone else might charge? Or is this a low value engagement? And that's not a reflection on you. That might just be the reality of the circumstance. Like, you might be the best in the world at solving this problem, but it's just not that painful to this client. It's not that big of a deal, or they're not that big, so it doesn't create a lot of leverage for them. And maybe this work is kind of so simple that it doesn't really matter that you're an expert in X, Y, and Z, because they could hire a million other people to do the same thing. And that's kind of a low value situation or context to be selling in. Not inherently problematic, but something you got to keep in mind. And so that's sort of something we talk about a lot, I think, in the pricing conversation in our industry. The other thing that doesn't get explicitly talked about a lot, but everybody sort of intuitively thinks about, is risk. So is this a high risk project, in that it's really hard to predict what it's going to cost us to get this done, either because we don't know how much time it's going to take, or the scope isn't very clear, or the problem is just kind of hard. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's a hard engineering problem. It's a hard UX problem. It's a research problem. It's an iterative problem, whatever the case might be. Maybe it's that the client doesn't even really know what they want or need, and so there's a certain amount of work that needs to get done just to figure out what's going on, right? So there's all kinds of reasons that it could be high risk, and it's just like not feasible to try and guess how much it's going to cost. And of course, there's low risk work, which is like, yeah, we've done this before. The scope is clear. We have a process. We can come within, 20% of the budget, with a high degree of confidence. That's low risk work. So once you identify where you sit in terms of value and in terms of risk, generally speaking, low value and high risk, that's where time materials makes a lot of sense. So a retainer might look like, an hourly time materials retainer, where you're going to pay us, in advance for this many hours, and we're going to use up those hours. Ideally, you can do this in such a way where it's kind of a use it or lose it model, where, at the end of every month, if they haven't used up all the hours, they're not going to get any credits back. Or if you are rolling stuff over, there's like an expiration date on that. You're not dragging it out indefinitely. Maybe you have a 90-day window to try and make up for that. And that really becomes a question of proactive scope management. The benefit with that is, ideally in a time materials model, because it's high risk, if it takes you more time than expected, then you're getting paid for that time. And I think the key here is really, from an account management perspective, always being clear on, every time something changes, how it changes the outlook. And really, when you think about this on a monthly cadence, if the client's asking you for something that is going to push you over hours for that month, then the conversation should be very simple. It's like, well, we could do that this month, but there's going to be an overage that we have to bill you. Or we can try to move some things into next month and come in underneath, the limit that we have. So really what that arrangement is like, you're paying us for a certain amount of capacity in advance so we can allocate it to your project and move at a certain velocity. And if they want to move at a faster velocity, it costs them more money. If you go up to a high value, high risk engagement, it's basically the same idea, but we just like to abstract time materials in that instance. So the abstraction is generally happening on two vectors. The first vector is the time unit itself. So instead of selling hours, we go to bigger time units, days, weeks, biweekly, monthly increments. And generally we want to abstract across people as well. So instead of selling time for like one individual on the team or one role, we start to go to cross-functional teams. So an example could be, hey, you want us to build a giant software product for you? Well, our cross-functional software development team is $20,000 per 2-week sprint. And again, it's kind of the same idea as with hourly billing, but you just have larger blocks to work with. And the reason you want to do that for high value engagements is it gets the conversation away from hours. So you can often increase your hourly rate, and you can still actually get rewarded for being efficient. If you can get a 2-week sprint worth of work done in 9 days, then you're good, and you've technically increased your profitability, and you might be able to actually do other work and earn more revenue in the meantime. So that's the high risk side. And then on the low risk side, you have flat retainers. So that would be like, hey, this scope of work, this many blog posts per month with this many social posts with whatever, is X per month, right? So you really fix the fee, you fix the deliverables. Those things are static. That changes the account management conversation to more of a preventative one, or if the client wants something big, you're either trading horses or you're just like saying no, or you're saying yes, but we have to change the terms of this agreement because they're fixed to deliverables. And then the last piece is the value-based pricing one, which is, it can look a lot like a flat retainer, but instead of tying the price to the deliverables, you tie the price to something a little bit more ephemeral, like the value or the impact that it would theoretically have on the client. And in a more extreme case, it becomes value-based from the perspective of performance. So performance-based compensation, where you might say it's a flat fee of X plus this percentage of ad spend. Ad spend is a really common example that we see for value-based pricing, or per conversion, or per new lead, or per additional dollar of revenue that you make above and beyond this sort of baseline that we set. There's a whole bunch of ways to skin that cat, but it can be very challenging to do that well, because attribution, as we all know, is a big challenge. And the reason we put that in the low risk side is because you have to de-risk not only the cost, you have to be able to understand what you think it will cost you to get a certain outcome, but you also need to be able to de-risk the outcome, because that's what you're tying the price to. So that is at a high level how we would think about landing on a type of retainer that is appropriate given the value and risk profile of the thing that you're selling. And again, if you want to go much deeper on that, see some visuals on it, I'll leave a link in the show notes to a podcast episode that goes deeper. So with all of that, Carson, anything you want to add to that before we move into like, okay, we picked a model, now how do we actually make sure the thing is profitable on the back end?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One, there's another element of risk, I think, when it comes to retainers, and that's around flexibility. So you kind of touched on this already, but on one end of that spectrum, you've got use it or lose it, where the risk is all on the client. If they don't spend their hours, they've paid for it anyway, they don't get any money back. And on the other end of the spectrum would be, hey, you can roll over your hours indefinitely as much as you want. And then the risk goes all to the agency, where they could get stuck doing 500 hours over Christmas because the client built it all up and didn't spend it. So there's that element too that I think we need to think about when it comes to pricing it. And that leads me to my second thought, which is I'm curious what your thoughts are on the actual pricing of things. So if we think about things in terms of dollars per hour, what's your take on the value of, or the rate that you charge for a retainer versus project-based work? Because I think there's different takes on this, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, generally speaking, the incentive has been to discount retainer rates because you're getting a prepayment, right? So in the same way that you go sign up for a software product, most software products will offer you anywhere from 10 to 20% off if you pay them for a year upfront. And the reason they do that is because it improves their cash flow. Now, the reason that you would do that as a service business is because it improves your cash flow, which is a dangerous trap, but nonetheless, assuming you're doing accrual accounting properly, you won't fall into that trap. The other reason that is incredibly important for you as a service-based business is theoretically what it allows you to do is de-risk your utilization and your forecasting quite a lot. And that is like a super important thing for your profitability. So the logic there would be, okay, I might take 10 or 20% off what I could sell this project for. But the bet that you're placing is by having a lot of consistency and certainty, I will make that back by not having these gaps in utilization that cost me more than 20% or 10% of the upside that I would get by doing everything on a project basis. So that's sort of an assessment on your demand. It's sort of assessment on how lumpy your projects and client work tend to be. But that's not an unreasonable heuristic or an unreasonable bet to be placing. I think it's a reasonable thing. So generally speaking, the idea is you're going to offer some kind of better pricing for your retainers. Now, I don't think that that is necessarily like gospel, but if you're selling time in both instances, it's a little bit hard not to do that unless you can do one of two things: position the retainer as a better solution to the client's problem. There's a lot of instances where that might be the case, right? So if you can really get them understanding perhaps that there is a process that needs to take place and that this is a better way to facilitate that process, right? That might be one angle. The other angle would be if you just have such a high demand on your time that this is literally the only way that they can get what they want when they want it. Right. So that historically, that was, in the best case scenario, how these professional services firms were positioning the retainer. It was like, hey, client, you know, if you want me to be able to just pick up the phone and answer your questions whenever you want and get things done whenever you want, then you're going to have to pay us in advance because, you and everybody else wants that. So either get in line or, pay for your fast pass, essentially. Those are some initial thoughts on that. Carson, I'm curious if you have anything to add to that.
No, I agree with everything you said. There are two other pieces that come to mind. One is if you have an agreement for a certain amount of time, a block of time per month, for example, and they go over, they want to spend those extra hours or buy extra hours in that month. Typically, I'll see that rate jump up again. And of course, you're incentivizing clients to buy the actual amount of hours they need and not, I'm going to buy the minimum and then just use up as many overage hours as I want because there's no penalty for that. So generally, you're going to have a higher rate for those overage hours. And then the other part is going back to that risk factor. If there's no flexibility for the client, meaning the use it or lose it model, generally you may find yourself having to discount that a little bit more versus, hey, you create all this flexibility, they can roll over their hours, then you typically would be able to charge a bit more for that.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode and I'll let you get back to it. Now, one thing that I think is worth noting here is your posture in the relationship has a massive bearing on your ability to, I think, shift towards something that is much more use it or lose it and is much more, leaning towards a capacity leasing model, which is like, those are great businesses. I think a lot of people still poo-poo on anything that looks like time materials, but like anybody that I've spoken to that has a well thought out labor arbitrage model where they're essentially like placing staff and leasing them out, they're doing great. That's a good business if you have 70% margins on that time and you're utilizing people at 100%. That's really good. So anyway, what I'm getting at here is if the posture with the client is, yeah, we just do whatever you ask us to do, whenever you ask us to do it, and you're just purely order taking, like, so that being one extreme, then it's really hard not to have to give the client a lot of flexibility or discount significantly in order to get them to give you like a large commitment, um, because you're on your back foot all the time and you really are at their whim. And so, that's just how that's going to go. However, if you're able to get into more of a posture, which is, hey, we're helping you create a plan and a roadmap, and we're being very proactive and we're looking far out ahead at what you might need. And we're regularly like meeting and aligning on that plan. And you can look out into the future and see all the work that's going to need to get done to move them from where they are to where they want to go. Then it is much easier to start to say, hey, here's like an amount of capacity that we think is appropriate that allows us to move at a pace that is going to get you to where you want to go in the timeline that you want to go on. It still gives you a ton of flexibility because you can always be reprioritizing things and making changes, but it's much easier to come to an agreement because what you're basically saying is we have way more work than what we could possibly do in 1 month. The question is just how are we sequencing and prioritizing that work? And the more you can be on your front foot about that, the better posture you have to create a retainer that puts you in a much better position in terms of not having to discount, in terms of not having to have additional overhead management and risk associated to sort of building up a debt to that client on the balance sheet, or essentially having to be very reactive from a resource planning and work management perspective.
Yeah, and that's what I see in the use it or lose it models. Which, if you can get it, great. It's wonderful, but I think it requires the agency to be a lot more proactive. They're the ones that have to set up, quarterly road mapping sessions and building up a backlog and all that kind of thing. If you're not doing that, what typically happens is things tail off, clients don't get the value, and then they churn because, hey, why am I paying for this amount? You have to be on top of those things. But when you are, like you said, you're in charge, and you can drive that a lot better.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm sure we both had this conversation with clients before where they're like, a good example of this is like hosting, where they're like, oh yeah, look at these clients, they're so profitable. They pay us $500 a month to host their website. We hear from them twice a year. And sure, some of them, they just don't know any better. So they'll be around for 10 years and good on you. But there is a point, especially in this use it or lose it retainer model, where a lack of engagement is actually a negative thing, not a good thing. And so, although that might be super profitable for a few months, it's probably a sign that they're going to be going to zero pretty soon.
Yeah, and we've looked at that before when we look at client reporting, agency reporting, where we're saying we typically look at the contracts or the projects that are over budget, but I always take a look at those ones that are way under budget too, because they have their own set of risks. That's a whole different conversation.
100%. Okay, so we've talked about I think a lot of really good things on the pricing side of things, right? What are the different variants of retainers? How might we think about those? What's a way to start to get an understanding of which form of retainer might be appropriate for your engagement? Now, I think the thing that's worth talking about is how do you make sure that a retainer is profitable on the back end? Understanding that, and we just sort of touched on a few of them, the way that you manage that engagement is going to change a little bit based on what kind of retainer it is and what the scope is actually tied to.
Yeah, and this gets really tricky because there, well, you need to track your time against what you're doing. Even if you're not charging time and materials, you still need to know how much is going into it to know if it's profitable or not. And the thing I see a lot is a lot of stuff just not getting tracked. For example, though, if you're doing road mapping sessions or planning sessions or whatever, I've seen agencies sort of slide that under like a sales bucket that doesn't get charged to clients. So you're not counting those hours. There's other project management time that quite often slides by, oh, this is just part of the management of the account. We're not going to count those hours. And you end up spending twice as many hours as you actually have planned. Therefore, you're making half as much per hour. So yeah, being able to stay on top of the numbers that are involved with managing a retainer is really important. And quite often that's where people make mistakes.
One of the things that I think is important to touch on here is the difference between a billable and a delivery hour. And I think this becomes problematic in these retainers that are actually tied to time and materials, especially if there is some concept of like rollover hours or only billing for what was used. And, the challenge that you often see there is, okay, well, this isn't billable time. So, where do we put it? And this is where I think it becomes really useful to be able to differentiate between like how much time did it actually take to service the client, even if that's different than how much time we build to the client. And often they are going to be different, right? Like we make mistakes, we mess things up, or we choose to like do things that the client didn't ask for because they make sense for us or whatever the case might be. So, billable versus delivery hours, I think for a lot of firms, it would behoove you to differentiate those things.
Yeah, something that just came to mind as you were describing that is there's one other reason that you'll see a lot of hours logged that don't go into that billable column, and it's around the relationship with that client. And it's dangerous because retainers by nature are longer term; they can go on for years, and you create a dynamic, a habit in that relationship that can just go sideways. Oh yeah, you have a really demanding client. We're going to do this extra work to keep them happy, and I'll like unless you're reviewing that all the time, you don't realize that how far things have gone off the tracks. So again, keeping on top of your numbers and being able to see that is really important. And you just may get to a point where you're like, you know what, this agreement doesn't make sense anymore for the amount of effort we have to put in to maintain that monthly contract. You can't afford to do it anymore.
Yeah. So, okay, we've talked a little bit about keeping track of the data. So let's go to the next step. Let's assume that we're in a situation where we can see that there's a lot more time going in than is reasonable, is feasible. How might a firm think about getting that back on track or rectifying that situation?
Oh, man, I mean, that's like any other painful contract negotiation, I think, where you have to be able to go back to that client and talk about what what is actually happening for the amount that they're paying, what that works out to in terms of hourly, um, and just having that renegotiation conversation. I think it's not comfortable, it's not fun, but at some point you may have to go to rescope things, talk about pricing or descoping, whichever way you want to bend that. But ultimately, you have to get that back under control because otherwise, you're going to end up with a roster full of bad retainers that, instead of being that nice cash cushion that you can look forward to every month, is actually just kind of a nightmare in the background.
Yeah. All right. I'm the frameworks guy, so I'm gonna bring the three R's to this conversation, which is basically what you just touched on, right? So we generally talk about this as three R's being recapture, rescope, replace. So recapture being, okay, the time that you're spending that you're not being paid for, is there a way to get paid for that? So of course, if you're on a time and materials thing, then it's like trying to bill for more of that time. If you're not on a time and materials thing, it's like, can you go to the client and say, hey, here's a new price that captures more of this effort, right? And to your point, in some cases, maybe the answer is no, or maybe you're just not in a position to be able to do that. So then we go to number two, which is rescope. So, okay, can we take things out of the scope of work so that it fits, the amount of effort that's required to get this thing done fits to the price that the client's actually paying. And again, if you can't do either of those things, then option number three is, can you replace the client? This is so important for recurring revenue businesses. But there's nuance to this. I think we've talked about this on other episodes. You don't want to just replace clients willy-nilly, because if your utilization is low, you're not really actually going to get a whole lot of benefit from that. So the best possible time to replace clients is when you're so busy that you're like, man, if we close one more client, we're going to have to go hire some people or bring in some freelancers. And on that day, when you close the new client at the new rates and it's a fresh relationship and the scope is clear and you're like, oh, this is going to be so good and so profitable, that is the perfect day to go to your worst client and say, hey, it's been such an honor working with you. However, your needs have evolved, things are changing, and I'm concerned that the scope of work that we have is not enough for us to meet the expectations that you've got going forward. I think we need to renegotiate this. And again, you try to rescope, you try to recapture. And if none of those things will work for them, then you go, hey, you know what? No problem. We totally understand. Let us introduce you to someone else. And I know that it seems crazy. How could pushing revenue out the door make you more profitable? But think about it. You were going to go spend more money to take on this new client that you know is more profitable. But now you can replace the bad client that wasn't that profitable with a new client that's more profitable, and your costs have not changed. Therefore, your profit has increased. But what mostly happens there is, out of 5 clients that you try to go have that renegotiation conversation with, one of them will leave. The rest of them will all get better. And so you just use that lever. So the replacement, I think, is a really critical piece to evaluate, especially if you're doing a good job of keeping your team busy. That's where you have a lot of leverage. So I think that's a big one. 3 R's.
And I actually have an agency I'm working with right now that is overbooked. And they're finding hiring very difficult, both in terms of finding the right people, but also, hey, we can hire someone to handle this glut of work that we have, but now we have to spend the next 2 months training people, getting everyone up to speed, which is going to just slow them down even more. And they're really at a point where slowing things down a little bit is in their best interest. And that's that whole replace model, which they have to go through their roster and figure out which ones are not providing them the profitability they want.
It's a powerful thing to do. I remember we did an audit with a client years ago, and they were really struggling with this. They had been around for a long time. They had clients that have been with them forever, like a decade. And man, when we did that ABR analysis, there was some skeletons in the closet, man. There was clients that were literally costing them money. They were paying to work with these clients every month. They were so unprofitable. And when we analyzed, like, okay, these new clients that are coming in at these new rates, if everybody was at that level with your current capacity, I think their revenue was going to go up like 60% and their profit up 500% without adding any headcount to the business, just by replacing clients. So like, that's an extreme example, but that's the power of this exercise. So I would encourage you to, if you have a lot of recurring business and you're getting busy, think deeply about this. The other thing that I think is worth talking about here is the nuance, but this is such an important nuance between time-based retainers and how you have account management conversations versus like flat and deliverable based conversations. And the nuance there that I always use is, when you are on a time-based billing model, and it doesn't matter what the scope is, as long as you're getting paid for that time, the answer to every client request is yes. And is that more or less important than these other things in the backlog? And here's sort of the totality of what we think this work means, or the timeline, right? However you're expressing that, that's your job, is just to say yes to everything. You're incentivized to say yes to everything, or even say yes, and have you thought of these other 5 things that we could also do? Like, you want to maximize the scope as long as the client understands what that means in terms of like, here is how that will play out over time. Whereas if you're in a fixed scope situation, the answer is yes, but. And you do either have to swap something out of the scope, or you have to open the scope of work up and, restructure it and get paid more money for that thing, or you have to explicitly eat that cost. And so it is a very different posture from an account management perspective. And I think that that's an important thing to call out, because especially in firms, and we see this, small firms that have a lot of these things going on, as an account manager, it can become a little disorienting to start going into, you're bouncing around between client calls and they're asking you for things, because that's what clients do. And you start to kind of lose track of like, wait a second, like, what am I tethering myself to here in this engagement? Like, what did we sell these people? Did we sell them time? Did we sell them deliverables? And you can start to make mistakes in those instances. So being really aware of that, I think, is a key lever to just like the way that conversation takes place.
Yeah. And of course, the project manager from my past is jumping in here to go, yeah, but let's consider the PM need as well, because it's one thing to be incentivized, keep selling more and more, but you also have to plan for that time too. So again, back to capacity management.
Totally. But this is where I'll say I really, really love abstracted time material billing models for this exact thing, where if you're doing this well, and this is very popular among software development firms, especially that run the agile methodology, it's like you have the backlog is the anchor point of the client conversation. And so it's just like everything that they ask you for, every idea that you have for them, it's just like, where does it fit in the backlog? but we're moving at this pace. Every 2 weeks, like we're moving. This is roughly what we think we're getting done. Plan out the backlog. And it's that when it's working well is beautiful. It's profitable. The PMs are happy. The AMs are happy. The clients are happy. And, the devs are usually pretty happy too, because they're doing agile. So if you do a lot of complex stuff, that model, it's not easy to transition to, and it's not necessarily easy to learn how to sell it. But once you figure it out, it's actually quite nice.
Yeah. You know what? I think if I had to like roll this all up into a nice bundle, that for me feels like the solution. Obviously, every client is different. Every agency works differently. But that feels like one of your best case scenarios is you've got abstracted time and materials, you've got a backlog, you've got some consistency and some predictability. Everyone seems to win there. So if I could recommend just one way, that would probably be it.
The only challenge or the only caveat with that model is it tends to require enough scale and enough complexity to justify that model, if that makes sense, right? So like if you're, I don't know, doing 10 social media posts a month for a client, it's like, it's probably overkill. You know what I mean? You're sort of bringing a bazooka to a fist fight, if that makes sense. So
I've definitely seen like contracts that are 15 hours a month and you spend 5 of them planning. The client's just not getting the value at that point, right?
100%. Yeah. So there is certainly like a certain amount of scale that's required there. But if you have some scale, you have some complexity. I am a fan of that billing model. I think it's really quite interesting. And if you want to sort of go into the thought leadership sphere around this, just look up like selling agile contracts. And there's like a good bit of very niche content on this exact thing, because there's a bunch of people that started building software a decade ago that really wanted to use the agile methodology when it was all the rage, and they had to figure out how to do that, and they come up with some pretty interesting models. All right. Well, I think this has been a very productive conversation, Carson, and hopefully everyone listening to this agrees. Otherwise, they're not listening to us anyway, so who cares? But I enjoyed it, so that's got to count for something.
Well, and I always learn stuff whenever I chat with you, Marcel. It's a great thing.
Well, I think this has been a successful episode. I want to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to this. If you did enjoy this, then reach out to us, leave us a comment, send us a message. We always love to hear from you. And with that, we'll see you on the next episode. Speak to you soon.
Bye.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.